I opened my bedroom door, expecting an empty apartment. Instead, I found my ex-wife's sister asleep in my bed. 3 weeks later, I was standing in her parents' living room, defending both of us against an accusation that had nothing to do with the truth. I need to explain who Grace actually was before that night makes any sense. I was married to Melissa for 6 years. It ended about 18 months before this story starts. Not through betrayal, just two people who'd slowly grown apart and finally admitted it out loud. The divorce was civil, mostly, the careful, distant civility of people who share nothing left to fight over. Grace, Melissa's younger sister, had been one of the genuinely good parts of that marriage. She was 5 years younger than Melissa, warmer, less guarded, the kind of person who showed up early to help set up for family gatherings and stayed late to help clean up after. During my marriage, Grace and I had an easy, comfortable relationship. She'd crash on our couch when she was in town, borrow kitchen equipment she never returned, treat our apartment like an extension of her own life, the way close family does. I remember, in particular, one Thanksgiving, early in the marriage when Grace had shown up a full day before everyone else, insisting she wanted to help me prep the turkey, because Melissa always burns everything and pretends she doesn't. We spent that entire afternoon in the kitchen together, laughing about nothing in particular, and I remember thinking, even then, that Grace had a specific gift for making any room she was in feel warmer and less formal than it otherwise would have been. After the divorce, I saw much less of her, the same quiet casualty that happens to a lot of extended family relationships once the marriage that created them ends. She'd send an occasional text on my birthday, nothing more. I assumed, reasonably, that whatever closeness we'd had was mostly a product of the marriage, not something that would survive independent of it. I had absolutely no reason to expect her in my apartment at all, let alone asleep in my actual bed, on an ordinary Thursday night 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I got home late from a work dinner, tired, not thinking about much beyond getting to sleep. I opened my bedroom door and froze. Grace was curled up under my covers, still wearing her coat, one shoe still on, clearly having collapsed there in a state of complete exhaustion rather than any kind of planned visit. Her purse sat on the floor beside the bed, one strap still looped around her wrist even in sleep, as if some part of her hadn't fully let herself relax even unconscious. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, genuinely unsure what I was looking at, before she stirred, opened her eyes, and focused on me with a mixture of confusion and dawning embarrassment. "Daniel," she said, sitting up fast, disoriented, her hand immediately going to smooth down hair that had clearly been slept on. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I don't even really remember how I got here." "It's okay," I said, though it very much did not feel okay yet, my mind racing through a dozen possible explanations, none of them settling into something that made immediate sense. "Are you all right? What's going on?" She looked at me for a long moment, something fragile crossing her face, before she said the only thing that seemed to matter to her in that moment. "Can I stay here? I had nowhere else to go tonight." I told her, of course, and sat down on the edge of the bed while she slowly explained what had actually happened, that she still had a spare key from years earlier, during my marriage to Melissa, that she'd never returned and I'd genuinely forgotten she still had, that she'd been in a relationship for the past year with a man named Trevor, a relationship that had turned controlling, then frightening over recent months, in ways she'd been too ashamed to tell her family about. That night, an argument had escalated into something that scared her badly enough that she'd left with nothing but her purse and driven, without fully deciding to, toward the one place that had always felt safe to her, even years after the reason for that safety had technically ended. "I wasn't thinking clearly," she admitted, her voice still shaky. "I just drove here. I let myself in with the key, and I think I sat on your couch for a while, and then I don't really remember deciding to go into the bedroom. I think I just needed to feel like I was somewhere nobody could get to me." Grace stayed for what was supposed to be one night, and then a few more, as we both slowly worked through what she actually needed to do: file a police report about the incident with Trevor, figure out a safe way to retrieve her remaining belongings from the apartment they'd shared, decide whether to tell her family the full truth about what had actually driven her out that night. I gave her my bedroom without hesitation, taking the couch myself, and over those first several days, I watched her slowly come back into herself, the fear gradually replaced by a kind of quiet, determined resolve as she worked through the practical steps of actually leaving Trevor for good. I drove her to the police station the second morning, sat in the waiting room while she gave her statement, and drove her home afterward in a silence that felt more like relief than sadness. We talked most evenings, Long conversations that reminded me exactly why I'd liked having her around during my marriage. She told me things about the relationship with Trevor she hadn't told anyone yet. The specific, gradual way his control had built. So slowly she hadn't fully recognized it, until it was already deeply entrenched, starting with small things like questioning her friendships, and escalating, over months, into monitoring her phone and controlling her schedule. I told her about my own life since the divorce, the quieter, smaller shape it had taken, and found myself, somewhere in those conversations, genuinely looking forward to her company in a way that surprised me. About a week in, she said something that stuck with me. I keep thinking about how strange it is that the place I ran to, without even really deciding to, was here. Not my parents' house, not a friend's place. Here. I think some part of me never stopped thinking of this apartment as somewhere safe, even after everything with Melissa ended. I don't mind that you thought of it that way, I said. I'm glad you did, honestly, given what you were running from. She retrieved her belongings from Trevor's apartment about 10 days later, with a police escort arranged as a precaution, and I remember waiting in my car outside the building the entire time, more nervous than she seemed to be, relieved when she finally emerged with 2 suitcases, and nothing more said between her and Trevor than what was strictly necessary. She didn't cry until we were back in the car, and I let her, driving slowly, giving her the space to let out what she'd been holding together through the entire retrieval process. "That's it," she said, once she'd caught her breath. "That's the last time I ever have to be in a room with him." "How does it feel?" I asked. "Lighter," she said. "Terrifying, still, a little, but mostly lighter." About 2 weeks in, Melissa found out Grace was staying with me, not from either of us directly, but from a mutual friend who'd mentioned seeing Grace's car parked outside my building. Melissa called me immediately, and I could hear, even before she said much, exactly how she'd already decided to interpret the situation. Her voice had that specific, controlled sharpness I remembered from the worst arguments of our marriage, the tone she used when she'd already reached a conclusion and was really just looking for confirmation of it. "My sister is staying with you," she said, not a question. "Care to explain that?" I explained everything. Trevor, the night she'd shown up, the reasons she hadn't felt safe going to your parents' house directly, still processing how to even tell them the full truth. Melissa listened, but I could tell, by the specific quality of her silence, that she wasn't fully absorbing it the way I'd hoped. "So my ex-husband and my little sister are living together," she said, once I'd finished, each word landing with deliberate weight. "That's not remotely as simple as you're making it sound, Daniel." "It's exactly that simple," I said. "She needed somewhere safe. I had a spare room. That's the entire story." "Grace has always liked you," Melissa said, an edge creeping into her voice now. "Even during our marriage, honestly. In a way, I used to brush off as nothing. I don't think this is as innocent as you're presenting it." I felt something harden in me, hearing that. "That's an insane leap from 'she needed help' to whatever you're implying," I said. "She's dealing with an abusive relationship she hasn't even told your parents about yet, and you're worried about optics." "I'm worried about my sister," Melissa shot back, "who apparently trusted my ex-husband with something this serious before she trusted her own family. Forgive me for having questions about that. Maybe if you'd asked her directly instead of building a theory from a parking lot sighting, you'd already have those answers," I said, more sharply than I intended. There was a long pause on the line, both of us breathing but not speaking, the kind of silence that happens when 2 people who used to know how to de-escalate each other have lost that particular skill somewhere along the way. I heard her exhale, sharp and frustrated, before she spoke again. Melissa didn't have an immediate response to that, but I could tell the conversation hadn't actually changed her mind. It had just given her something else to be upset about. She hung up shortly after, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, understanding that whatever civility had existed between us since the divorce had just taken a real hit. Over the following week, Melissa took her concerns directly to their parents, framing the situation in a way that stripped out most of the actual context, presenting it as her sister moving in with her ex-brother-in-law under circumstances Melissa characterized as inappropriate and concerning, without ever mentioning Trevor, the abuse, or the genuine crisis that had actually driven Grace there in the first place. Grace's parents called her, upset and confused, asking pointed questions about her judgment, about why she hadn't come to them directly, about what exactly was going on between her and her sister's ex-husband. Grace, still not fully ready to disclose the full truth about Trevor, found herself fumbling through a conversation that made her sound evasive rather than genuinely scared, which only deepened her parents' concern. She called me afterward, visibly rattled, replaying the conversation and second-guessing every answer she'd given. They kept asking why I hadn't just come home, she told me, and I couldn't explain that without explaining the actual reason, which I still wasn't ready to say out loud to them, so I just sounded evasive and strange, and I could hear how much worse that was making things sound. Maybe it's time to just tell them everything, I said. The full story, not just enough to make Melissa's version stop making sense. I know, she said. I've just been avoiding it, because saying it out loud makes it real, in a way I haven't been ready for yet. Right now, it's a thing that happened to me privately. The second I say it to my parents, it becomes something the whole family carries too, and I don't know why that feels harder, but it does. The family tension escalated further when Grace's parents insisted on a sit-down conversation, at their house, with the whole family present, Melissa included, to sort out what's actually going on. Grace asked me to come, understandably nervous about facing that room alone, and I agreed, fully aware of how strange my presence there was going to look to a family already primed to be suspicious of me. We drove there together mostly in silence, Grace rehearsing what she wanted to say under her breath more than once during the 20-minute drive. The family gathering happened on a Sunday afternoon, tense from the moment I walked through the door. Melissa's expression made clear exactly how unwelcome she considered my presence, and her parents greeted me with a careful, guarded politeness that told me they'd already absorbed most of Melissa's framing before Grace had the chance to offer her own. Grace's mother offered me coffee out of pure habit, then seemed to catch herself, unsure whether hospitality was still appropriate given the circumstances she believed she was walking into. "We need to understand what's actually happening," Grace's father said, once everyone was seated in the living room, his tone measured but clearly strained. "Melissa says you've moved in with Daniel. That's a significant thing to do without talking to any of us first." Grace took a breath, and I watched her gather the specific courage it takes to say something you've been avoiding for weeks, in front of the people whose reaction you're most afraid of. Her hands were shaking slightly in her lap, and I resisted the urge to reach over and steady them, aware that this moment needed to be entirely hers. "I need to tell you the actual reason I left Trevor's apartment 3 weeks ago," she said, voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "Because it's not what Melissa's been telling you, and I think I've let her version stand for too long. Because saying the real one out loud terrifies me." She told them everything, the control that had built gradually over the past year, the specific night that had finally scared her enough to leave with nothing but her purse, the spare key she still had from years earlier, the fact that some instinct had driven her, without fully deciding to, toward the one place that had always felt safe. Her mother started crying partway through, hand pressed to her mouth. Her father's expression shifted from confused irritation into something much heavier, his jaw tightening with each new detail Grace revealed. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" her mother asked, voice breaking, leaning forward like she wanted to physically close the distance the secrecy had created. "Because I was ashamed," Grace said. "Because admitting how bad it had gotten felt like admitting I'd let it happen, even though I know now that's not actually how it works. And because the moment Melissa found out I was staying with Daniel, the story became about that instead of about what I was actually running from, and it was easier to let everyone be upset about the wrong thing than to say the real one out loud." Melissa sat through this visibly stunned, the careful narrative she'd built over the previous weeks collapsing in real time, her composure cracking with each new detail she was clearly hearing for the first time. "I didn't know," she said quietly, barely audible. "About Trevor? I had no idea it was that serious." "You didn't ask," Grace said, not unkindly, but firmly, meeting her sister's eyes directly. "You saw me staying with my ex-brother-in-law and decided you already knew the whole story without checking any of it with me first." The room stayed quiet for a long moment after that, the entire framing of the situation having shifted completely. Grace's father finally spoke, addressing me directly for the first time that afternoon, his earlier guardedness replaced by something closer to genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology," he said. "We came into this conversation assuming the worst about your involvement, and it sounds like you were the person who actually kept my daughter safe when she needed it most." "I didn't do anything heroic," I said. "I just had a spare room and didn't ask questions the night she needed somewhere to go." "Anyone should have done the same. Not everyone would have," Grace's mother said quietly, wiping her eyes. "I think we all need to sit with that for a while." Melissa approached me privately before I left that afternoon, something genuinely apologetic in her expression for the first time since this had all started. She'd stepped out onto the porch, and I found her there a few minutes later, arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "I'm sorry," she said. "I built an entire narrative in my head because it was easier than considering there might be something more serious going on that I hadn't bothered to ask about directly. I think some part of me wanted there to be something simple and petty going on, because the alternative meant admitting I'd failed to notice my own sister was in danger." "I understand why the surface version looked strange," I said. "I just wish you'd asked Grace directly before deciding you already knew the answer." "I know," she said. "I'm going to do better with that, going forward, with both of you. It's been almost 8 months since that night I opened my bedroom door and found Grace asleep in my bed, exhausted and scared, and running from something she hadn't yet found the courage to name out loud. Grace and I are together now, genuinely, with her family's full knowledge and support, rather than the suspicion that first met us. Trevor was formally reported, and Grace has spent the months since rebuilding a version of her life that doesn't require hiding anything from the people who love her. She started therapy, something she told me she wished she'd done years earlier, and she says the process has helped her understand not just what happened with Trevor, but why she didn't recognize it sooner. Patterns she says she can now trace back further than she'd initially realized. Melissa and I are on better terms now than we managed during much of our marriage's final year, an unexpected outcome of a situation that could easily have gone the other way entirely. She's told me, more than once, that the whole experience taught her something important about the difference between protecting someone you love and simply assuming you already understand their situation without asking. We've had a few genuinely honest conversations since that Sunday afternoon, conversations that felt more real than most of what passed between us in the final stretch of our marriage. An odd kind of clarity that came out of a crisis neither of us had chosen. Grace's parents have become, unexpectedly, some of the warmest people in my life now. Her father calls occasionally just to check in, something he never did during my marriage to Melissa, and her mother has taken to sending me recipes she thinks I should try. A small, ordinary kindness that I don't think either of us takes for granted given how that Sunday afternoon could have gone instead. Last month, her father asked me, half joking, whether I still had the spare key Grace had used that first night. I told him I did, and that I had no plans to ever ask for it back. I think about that night often, how close Grace came to sitting alone with what she was carrying, and how easily the spare key, the muscle memory of an apartment that once felt like family, ended up being exactly what she needed, without either of us planning for it. I think too about how differently things could have unfolded if Melissa's version of events had been allowed to stand unquestioned, if Grace's parents had continued believing the surface story instead of eventually hearing the real one, if the shame Grace carried about Trevor had kept her silent long enough for Melissa's suspicion to become the only narrative anyone in the family actually believed. If there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's that sometimes the safest place someone runs to isn't chosen with a clear head. It's chosen by instinct, by whatever place still feels like it might hold them without judgment, even years after the reason for that safety has technically changed shape. Grace ran to a spare key and an old habit. I'm endlessly grateful that habit led her somewhere I could actually help, and even more grateful that when the truth finally had its moment in that living room, it turned out to be strong enough to outlast every wrong assumption that had been built around it in the weeks before. If this one got you, tell me in the comments, and if you want more real stories like this, subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you every week.